thank you all for coming. My name is CJ Idle. I'm the Executive Director of the Museum and Archives of Rockingham County. And for those of you who know me, you know my true passion and my actual background is in archaeology. I have a master's in anthropology from East Carolina, where I studied archaeology. And Cameron, our operations and programs manager, came to me and told me she wanted to do a program in November for Native American Heritage, and told me to basically figure it out. And I was like, all right, well, the Sara peoples, anybody who's lived in Rockingham County for very long or worked here for very long, the Sara peoples come up a lot. And I was like, well, let's do a deep dive on the Sara peoples and see what I can learn, see what information's out there, see if there's been any new information that's come out since a lot of the history of Rockingham County was written in the 80s and early 90s. And there has been. So, before I get started on my sort of thoughts and what I've learned, do any of y'all have any burning questions about the Sara people or the people who lived along the Dan River prior to European arrival? Might be a better way to phrase that, because I don't think they were all necessarily Sara, but that's a longer conversation we'll get into.
The two historical markers, one says lower and one says upper. Mm-hmm. Are they two different people or they're the same?
That's what I was kind of getting at, that they may not all be Sara. Because Lower Saratown is on the Dan River in Rockingham County, just outside of Eden. Upper Saratown is in Stokes County. Later on in the occupation, let me pull up my notes. I took lots of notes just because I knew I would not be able to remember all of this. So Lower Saratown, we think, was occupied roughly between 1607 and 1650. I will refer to that period moving forward as the proto-historic period, which basically means it's the time when they're trading with Europeans, but they haven't made direct contact with Europeans yet. And in this case, Europeans means English. Upper Saratown, I have to apologize, I gave you guys a wrong date. It's actually earlier than what I told you. We think was occupied between 800 and 1200 AD, and then they left, and then they moved back later on after contact in 1670 to 1710. And the reason, and there are a couple other sites that I'm pulling information from. There's Upper Saratown, which was definitely the first of the woodland period. Before the woodlands, there's the Archaic period. And we just don't know enough information about the Archaic and especially the Paleo-Indian, because the way most archaeology is done in the United States is by universities, especially at the level I've been trying to get at for this little project. And the Dan River goes in and out of North Carolina and Virginia, I think 7 times. And of course, those boundaries are just lines on a map. They didn't mean anything to these people. So there hasn't really been a systematic study of any of the occupations that would have happened before the woodland period. So because there's no university that wants to tackle that project. Virginia has its own history. A lot of North Carolina of Archaic and Paleo has been focused on the Hall River because we have the Hardaway Dalton site down south, and then we've got Moore Mountain and Town Creek. So there's just a lot of more interesting places, and the Dan River would have been on kind of the fringes of what was happening. So just never been an interest. We have the Hairston or Harston site, depending on how you want to pronounce that last name, which is also in Stokes County. It's just a little bit north of Upper Saratown. The Nifong site, which is even further north in Stokes. The William Klutz site, which is southeast of Upper Saratown. And then the Madison site, which is a little bit upriver from Lower Saratown. And the Madison site is a giant question mark, and I'll explain that at the end because it's part of kind of some lessons I want you guys to take away from this. So that was the long answer to your question, Valencia. Okay. The short answer is no. We don't know because we don't have written records. Historically, in history, the way we classify Native groups is by what language they spoke. So all of these people would be classified as Siouan speakers. The other major Siouan tribal group in the area, and you may be able to correct me if there's another one, is the Catawba and the Lumbee.
Waccamaw.
Yeah. Those are the big ones in the Carolinas. The Sioux are especially famous for much later in history because of the Lakota and the groups that we fought the Indian Wars with at the end of the 19th century. But and there have been questions, so like, would we consider people from England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, parts of India, would we consider all of them part of the same group and same tribe just because that we all speak English? So there are some questions about is classifying groups by tribal groups by their language the best way to understand what their like obviously they had interactions and they traded better with each other because we trade better with England and other English-speaking countries, but there are questions over how is that the best approach. Any other questions? And that kind of gives you guys a preview of how long-winded my answers are going to be, because there's so one of the first things I learned about the Sara is that they came to Rockingham County because they were trying to get away from the Spanish. I don't believe that anymore. And I say that because we have evidence at Upper Saratown that they were here at least 800. So there are people living on the Dan River thousands of years, hundreds of years, not thousands, hundreds of years, almost 1,000 years before Europeans even arrived in North America. And that information comes from a reading of Hernan de Soto. He was a Spanish conquistador who did a travel through the southeast United States, starting in Florida. He moved up to roughly modern-day Asheville, and then came back down the Appalachian Mountains and went back into Mexico. And he, in his writings, he refers to a group that has been translated to be the Chara. And another thing I learned about the Sara doing this project is they have like 11 names, and no one can agree what to call them. So he definitely encountered a Siouan-speaking group who had some similarities to what we would eventually know as the Sara people. Now, whether they're the same Sara people did they move? They could have. There's a gap. In our Juan Pardo was early 16th century. We don't have another person encounter native groups in North Carolina in the backcountry of the Piedmont until this German physicist named John Lederer 120 years later. So could they have moved? Yes, it's possible, but I think with the evidence that there are already people living on the Dan River, that and just knowing that how migrations would have worked, they would have stuck to the river. And I don't see them moving from Asheville to Rockingham County. Would they have traded with them? Oh, most definitely, because they're trading with people who speak similar languages, but I don't think they were driven north by the Spanish. And if at any point you'll have questions, please raise your hand. I was hoping to make this more of a conversation, but one thing we do know about the consequences of European contact that does happen, especially in that proto-historic period, we start seeing a change in their burial practices, especially at Upper Saratown. Upper Saratown's the better excavated of all the sites I listed off. And what it was interpreted as is we're starting to see European diseases arrive into the backcountry a couple decades ahead of actual Europeans arriving in the backcountry. So there's this massive population die-off, which is causing them to change the burial practice because they're having to bury more people, population's becoming imbalanced, and this is coming right off a massive population boom that probably happened sometime in the 1400s when maize, corn enters the area, and we see this big population boom because they're able to sustain larger populations with better farming techniques and a crop that grows better than what they were foraging for before.
Along that line, I think what I've learned along the way too, the burial practice was that inside the palisades,
Mm-hmm.
that they would have family units and they would bury their dead outside of the living quarters. It got to be so many deaths, they were burying their members inside the living quarters. And I think when they did the excavations, they found whole pits that were their cooking utensils, their clothing, their hunting. They had this invisible thing that was killing them. They didn't know what it was. So.
And further along, when you see them get into actual contact with Europeans, the death toll becomes so great that the burial practices change again, and they actually start having separate burial areas within the Palisades and separate living areas. And along those lines, we see a change in their agriculture and farming practices. And there's this really cool thing you do when you excavate certain units, and you have really thin screen, maybe a quarter of a millimeter or less. You get the smallest screen you can, and you run water over the dirt you took out of that feature, and it leaves behind evidence of plant materials. So we can know exactly what they were growing, what they were eating, what they were consuming. And in this period when they're changing all the burial practices, we see an increase in them growing and producing medicinal plants. So this disease really does change everything. And unfortunately, about 1650, there's another group on the Roanoke River called the Occaneechi. And during the protohistoric period, the Sara were trading with the Occaneechi, who were then trading with the English in the Chesapeake Bay area. I'm not a Virginian historian. I've worked there, but I don't know the exact why they did this. For some reason, the English colonists took out the Occaneechi and removed their middleman. So then the Sara start trading directly with the English, and that brings in more disease. And the Occaneechi were also providing a buffer from the Seneca, who would mark what we call the Great Wagon Road. Before it was the Great Wagon Road, was also a foot trading path that connected the Great Lakes all the way down to Georgia and the Gulf Coast. And the Seneca and the Six Nations of the Iroquois would raid down the trading path and attack and enslave other native groups and take them back up to the Great Lakes. And without the Occaneechi to provide that buffer from the Seneca raids, we see the Seneca raiding the Siouan-speaking people in North Carolina more, and they're getting hit with diseases from more increased contact with Europeans, and there's just this massive population die off. So much so John Lederer was 1670-ish. William Byrd II does his survey in 1729. There are no people living on the Dan River anymore in 1729. They had all disappeared. And where they went is conjecture. They probably went and joined up with other Siouan-speaking people, the Catawba. From there, they may have gone, and I read somewhere where they may have been the origins of the Lumbee tribe. That's all getting in conjecture because we just don't know what happened to them.
Do we know if he saw evidence?
He did he saw evidence of Lower Saratown, but he recognized that it was an area where the natives had lived, but it was completely abandoned.
So you said no people living on the Dan River. Was that in Rockingham County or
Yeah,
the whole?
I would stick with Rockingham and Stokes because a lot of let me see if I can find. I have this document. A lot of this information in 1999. Which one was it? Jane Eastman completed her dissertation called "The Sara and Dan River Peoples, Siouan Communities in North Carolina's Interior Piedmont from AD 1000 to AD 1700. And
What was her name again?
Jane Eastman. And basically what she did is she took all those sites I mentioned, none of them except for Upper and Lower Saratown had really been studied in any depth. And she tried to do a unified, look at all the sites, unify them, and the main crux of her dissertation is what's called pottery ceration, and that's where you take different styles of pottery, and we've got some examples we can look at in a little bit, and you group them based off exterior patterns, were they stamped? Were they cord impressed? Were they fabric impressed? Were they using their fingernails to create patterns? So, and you group things with like things, and then you look at other evidence from the archaeology, whether it's radiocarbon dating, other known materials that can be dated, and she created a timeline of pottery that's used to create these dates I've been throwing out there. So they're based off the archaeology that Dr. Eastman did in the 90s. And unfortunately, some of the sites, like Madison in particular, because I read the report for the Madison site, it was an amateur archaeologist who found this site. He excavated it. He did write up a report and publish it in the Southeastern Archaeology newsletter, but he was an amateur. He didn't know how to track for stratigraphy. He didn't know the proper field taking techniques. So that's why I said the Madison site is a question mark, because while we have his write-up, we don't have the field reports, we don't have field notes, we just have the artifacts and what this page and a half this guy wrote about the Madison site and his experience. So my ask, if you take nothing else away from this, if you have a site, please try to get in touch with archaeologists. There are some resources available that if it's your own private property, you can do whatever you want, but take notes, especially nowadays with smartphones. Pick up a GPS coordinate. So if you're out walking a field and you find a projectile point that you think is really cool, grab a GPS coordinate so we can know exactly where you found that, and that will go along. That one little step goes a long way in helping us build pictures. And maybe down the road we'll have a program about how to be amateur archaeologists, and we can have a little amateur archaeology team in Rockingham County going out and finding these sites, because I know of other sites, and other sites have been written about. But the other sites I mentioned were all cultural resource management projects in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. And that is anytime a project has federal funding, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act kicks in, and you're required to do archaeology to make sure you're not going to disturb a site, and if you are going to disturb a site, do some mitigation to make sure the information from that site is saved. So I can't remember which one it is. It's either Nifong or the Hairston site. When they were building North 311 through Stokes County, they discovered one of those sites, and that was a CRM project. So those are much smaller contained, because think of how small 311 is. So that's kind of, if you're curious how archaeology gets done in the modern era, that's pretty much federal funding. Do you have any questions so far?
I remember, the exhibit we have in the museum, the lady, we borrowed it from the North Carolina weather. That's where we got the photo. But if I remember correctly, there was something about a young man or a young person in Stokes County found the site and found some of those artifacts related to her.
Yeah, the Upper Sarch, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, that's what we were told, and I can't remember who told us yet, but and that led us to go to the North Carolina Museum of History and get that photograph of that lady. And according to, if I remember correctly, either was some of the bits of the clothing or something. Seemed like it was a teenage boy that found the.
Yeah. So
I never had a name.
Both Upper and Lower Sartown were known sites before they were fully excavated by the Archaeology Research Laboratory, or the Research Laboratory of Archaeology at UNC Chapel Hill. It's changed names a couple times, and I can't remember which one it is now. And it was actually, it was Trauerk Ward and Stephen Davis, the authors of this book, Time Before History, who were really involved with those projects. They were known sites, and they were looted. And so a lot of everything I've said tonight has to be caveated with these were pre-disturbed sites. We don't know what information was lost by the prior looting. That is interesting about the fabric because usually for fabric to survive in an archaeological site, it has to be in what's called an anaerobic environment or be in a spot where there is no oxygen getting to it, which if it's on the Dan, it may be in a muddy spot. They may have been able to recover it from a muddy spot.
I can't remember exactly but the story we were told is that a teenage boy found not just the fabric, it was other parts, and I guess based on what they simulated that the person would look like that, but I can't remember any details about it. But that's what the story was, and that we got the idea from the pit. We actually made a copy from something at the North Carolina Museum of History. I didn't work on, Dr. Butler worked on that exhibit mostly, and but I remember hearing that. I don't know if it was a lecture he did or something somebody else did, but I remember initially that's where they said they got that image of the lady we have in our exhibit.
Any other? Because I'm getting ready to dive in on foodways, and once you get me started on foodways, it's going to be hard to stop.
You said, when Bird arrived, there was no one lived on the dam. Were there any natives around at all, or not in the area at all?
I want to throw some shade at the Spanish government real fast. I was in Spain a month ago, and I visited their Museum of the Americas, and they have a map showing all the different habited areas of North and South America. And over this area of North Carolina and Virginia, they had these little hash marks and it said uninhabited. Obviously that's wrong because when the Spanish were here, this area wasn't inhabited. But it's because of the population decrease, you're seeing them, and the raiding that's happening, the more warlike and tribal groups that have been inclined to be more violent, they're being pressured, so they're raiding more. The English and other colonists are moving more inland and putting pressure through disease and more competition for land. So I could see them moving out and moving into more secure locations. Because we actually think that's what happened starting with the massive die-offs when they do start making contact with Europeans. They actually abandon Lower Sartown and move back to Upper Sartown because that's the location that they had been in before. They were more comfortable there. They had a deeper cultural connection there. So we see them moving back to areas they had previously occupied again because it's just to these population pressures that are happening.
Okay. They kind of consolidated again.
Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah.
This is for Stacy and CJ. Have there been artifacts found at the Penn Center?
Not to my knowledge.
And that Pioneer, that place, did you have Pioneer?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure the creek has changed over time, but not that I'm aware of.
Okay, I didn't know how far it reached beyond the Dan River.
The Tally Farm butts up to,
Oh, that's a slant, yeah.
and they did farming, raised tobacco and everything. They found a lot of points
Yeah.
on their farm over the years, and unfortunately, that collection or whatever they had, it disappeared somewhere. They loaned it out to somebody for a
And then
display, and it came back. It's a sad story, but yeah, I think they found a lot of stuff over the years farming. So I'm sure there's probably
Something. Yeah, nothing that I'm aware of, and I mean, I can't speak for the research firm, as they're doing like the walking trail and all those lands. I don't know. I mean, Joseph had mentioned it previously, but possibly.
So that does get me into the foodways topic.
Great setup.
Yeah. So before I get to that, I do want to mention, like I've already talked about maize and corn coming into the area. The earlier, the late archaic peoples, they're mostly on the Hall River and the Eno River. But then we see a larger population boom kind of happening on the Dan River, and there seems to be indication that that was because of corn and squash, more so corn, but squash did come at the same time, so I don't want to completely disregard squash. It seems to be that the Dan River Valley was better for farming. So when we see this introduction of this strictly this agricultural crop that is more labor intensive, and does allow for more complex societies to develop, we do see that's when people start coming to the Dan River more. And it seems to be this was the better place to farm than the Hall or and I live on the Hall River, and I can completely understand why the Dan would be better for growing stuff on. And throughout all the occupation of the Dan, deer was their primary food source. So you build your village with your farming, and then you go out in hunting groups, and that's where you may see sites like the farm you were talking about, or maybe at the Penn Center. These groups are going out, they're hunting, they'll do some cleanup, and they'll make their stone tools out in the field as they come across an outcropping of quartz or whatever material they find that works well. And they'll be doing some production at home, but they can do this stuff as they're moving, and you'll have seasonal hunting camps that are set up that are known sources of good rock, good visibility, and stable water supplies. So if you know of any springs, tributaries that have good stable water with high spots with good visibility, and maybe there's an outcropping of quartz or something in that area, you can pretty much guarantee there was a hunting camp there. What is interesting is there was another master's thesis from Chapel Hill that did a statistical analysis of all the fauna remains recovered from some of these sites I've been talking about. Deer is the biggest portion, but as we get into the later contact period, the overall portion of the faunal remains that are deer decreases. And they interpreted that as the SAR are becoming more involved in the fur trade, so they're more interested in the fur than they are the meat, so they're actually killing more deer than they need to bring back for food, and they're field stripping the leather off the hide off the deer and leaving the carcasses out in wherever they killed it, and just bringing the hides back to be traded to the English. So I thought that was an interesting little just all the ways. I love colonialism, such a fascinating topic to me, and all the ways these contacts of these two groups of people who had never met, and how both sides are changed by that contact in ways that I usually don't anticipate. And then some other things they're eating that are pretty standard for this area: turkey, box turtle, mud turtle, and bear. Those were the top things. And there are going to be some biases. Fishbone, if you're ever on the Dan River, I think there's a bridge near Madison, Mayadan, you can see a weir from, and I can't remember what bridge that is at low water.
Would be on 220, just west of Madison.
Yeah, you can see a fish weir that we think was built by natives in the river. So we know they were fishing, catching fish. But I think because fishbone's so small, and it could have been reused for other purposes like making fish hooks and things like that, weaving netting, it's not going to show up in the archaeological record as well. So keep in mind, archaeology is not perfect. There are biases, and we have to account for these biases. And I'm trying to tell you guys about these biases as I remember them. When another thing that happens when they come into contact with Europeans, watermelon and pears get introduced to their diet. Those are the two old world crops that they chose to adopt. I wish they would have picked some oranges, but well. What are some other? They're also eating. They're still collecting nuts. As we see agriculture, the maize and squash production become more important, we do see a decrease in acorn consumption. They do really like their walnuts. That seems to be a popular one. Of course, walnuts, between walnut, hickory, and acorn, walnut requires the least amount of time and effort to make edible. And I have a question that I don't think is going to be answered about acorn. Sorry, hickory takes the least time to process, not walnuts. Because acorn involves removing tannins from the nut before it can be edible. I'm wondering if the decrease in acorn is also related to them coming into contact with Europeans, because they're not going to be needing to tan their own hides as much, because the tannin from the acorn also probably would have been repurposed in the tanning, is a key ingredient in tanning leather. So I'm wondering if there's some correlation there, or I could just be seeing connections that don't exist.
So did you say they could eat acorns?
Yeah, if you process acorn and remove the tannin from the outer shell, it becomes edible.
Takes a while.
Yeah.
I've seen people do demonstrations where they boil it down, like they constantly have to pull the tannins out,
Mhm.
and eventually, and then, oh, it's delicious. But it don't sound.
But
You can eat them, I mean, hickory nuts are the same.
How long do you boil that acorn?
I've seen a demonstration where they did it like 3 separate times. They almost boil it, drain it, do it again, soak it, boil it down again. I mean, and I think it's more,
5 weeks?
it's more of a
10 weeks?
survival.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
it's
keep,
like a rock,
Yeah.
right?
and keep in mind, this is all their foodways are kind of based off a seasonal habit, kind of like we have, where you got the big agricultural seasons in late spring, summer, and then early fall. A lot of their nut production would be coming at late fall after the harvest, and then they'll be spending their winters going through these processes to make the nuts more edible. So they have some time. And then at the same time, you're sending out hunting parties, and the hunting and fishing is also based off seasonal availability. So yeah, it's just this cycle of the circle of life, to quote the Lion King. They've got their patterns down, and they know when and how much time they have to get this production done. Technology, I had some short stuff on here. We're basically seeing 3 types of pottery. The earliest is the Uwari style. I do not have an example of Uwari pottery. This is where my real interest in historical archaeology gets me in trouble, because I can't identify Native American pottery as well as I can European. We have some examples of Dan River pottery. I do know that because that's mostly net impressed, and that seems to be most of what we have in our collection at the MARC, which does sort of line up with what we're seeing. And what's really cool about Dan River pottery is everybody seems to want some. We see Dan River pottery showing up in South Carolina, Georgia, all the way up into the Ohio River Valley in Kentucky. So if you think about the Dan River, and this will help with understanding some of the trade routes they were engaged with. Dan River runs east-west mostly. Prior to the English arriving in Chesapeake Bay, the Great Wagon Road, the footpath before it becomes the wagon road, runs north-south along the Appalachian Mountains mostly. So the Dan River connects there, and then you can go north-south, or you can take through the Cumberland Gap, which is also what the colonists did. You can take the Cumberland Gap, and you can get into Kentucky and the Ohio River Valley. So they're much like early Rockingham County Europeans and Africans did, using the Dan River as a way to move goods east-west to get to these larger trading paths that are situated north-south and kind of northwest. And then once the English arrive in the Chesapeake, you see them also trading northeast on the Dan up into the Roanoke, and then getting into the Chesapeake Bay region. So the Dan River pottery seems to have just gone all over. It's called Dan River pottery mostly because it was first identified on the Dan River. So to say it originated in the Dan River may be wrong, but we at least know there's trade through here is really getting out and spreading across the interior parts of the continent. And then that's pretty much everything I've learned. There's a few other points, but they get more into conjecture and some things that it's just really hard to prove. So in archaeology, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I do not have extraordinary evidence, so I don't want to go down those roads in this setting. So any other questions? I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. We will be working on, we have, like Joyce said, we have an exhibit at the museum once, fortunately the museum is currently closed. We just got our HVAC fixed and now we've got to fix some other parts of the building. Once we get it reopened, I do have plans on taking our current SAR Indian exhibit and incorporating some of this information and expanding that exhibit and kind of giving it its own space to really dive into some of these larger issues. This also grew out of a program I did for the Dan River Basin Association earlier in the year for their Dan River Week. And I had no idea who John Lederer was before that presentation. And apparently he was the first European to reach the first person associated with English colonization to reach the interior of the North Carolina Piedmont. I do not recommend reading his work though.
Why?
He thought there was a desert south of here.
Oh,
So there are some questions over how much he actually explored and how much he just made up. And his original writing was done in Latin and was then translated into English by another person. And we've lost the original Latin copy, so all we have is the secondhand English translation. So, and there are just some things in there that just don't make, like, you're like, you really didn't do what you said you did. But
When did you say he was here?
1670s.
but you think about it, they're in a strange land, and they're seeing things they've not seen. And I always say, we tend to put our own lens on something, even though we've not seen it. And sometimes by putting our own lens on it, it can be distorted because it may look this way based on our lens, but if you dig deeper, it can mean something completely different. And as humans, we tend to do that. Even when we're being objective, it's hard to separate yourself from yourself and from your life experiences. It's basically what I'm saying. Even though we say we're being objective, in our mind we are. But you can only be so objective because you can't escape your life experiences totally. I know that's sounding strange.
No, it makes perfect sense. In recognizing your unconscious biases and understanding that we all have biases that we are both aware of and unaware of, and trying to account for those biases whenever we.
You put it nicely.
For a source, as a teacher to bring it in the classroom, what would be something that you would recommend?
A Time Before History.
Why?
It is for North Carolina and understanding the early archaeology, especially of Native Americans. It's the most comprehensive of what's been written. It's also written, it's not, so like time, typology, and point tradition. I love that book. It's an update. It's a much needed update on the point traditions in North Carolina, but that is very much a book written for archaeologists. A Time Before History is written more with the general public in mind. So even though it's at this point, it's been out for 20-ish years, so some of the information may not be as up to date as it could be.
But probably most teachers wouldn't even
Yeah,
know that.
but it's written at the level for the general audience. It's very comprehensive in its scope and what it tries to do, and it does so like the formative cultures of the Carolina Piedmont. While a great book, it was written very early on when archaeology is really becoming a standard scientific discipline. He's kind of at the forefront a little bit earlier, kind of getting into that in the late 50s, early 60s. So this is kind of bridging that gap. This is the first and really the only book that is like a modern archaeological using what we call, and it's called new archaeology. It's that scientific approach to understanding archaeology. So that would be where I would start. And as if you're like, and in archaeology can get very regional and very site specific. There's another good book that's been published recently, and I don't remember the name of it, but it does connect to the Saar peoples. There's a site just outside of Morganton called Droara, and it was a location where the Spanish built a fort for about 2 years, and it was one of those spots that the Saar were trading with in the mountains. And there's been a lot of good work done at Droara, so that's also a good for a teaching resource. So if you want to show your students archaeology happening as it's happening, and they also offer field schools students and teachers.
So where were the lower SARs located? What were the most common thing that they left behind to say they were where they were?
Just south of Eden.
Okay.
Pottery. I have so
Listening to your discussion, it seemed like they were not there very long.
in the grand scheme of the Dan River occupation, no, they weren't. If you look at the occupation as 700-ish years, they were maybe there for 50, 60. So a generation, maybe two.
So the fingerprint that they left behind would be fairly light.
Yeah, and it, I may have, you came in a little after we started, so I may have covered this, don't remember. It's very hard, like, they are moving, the people who are living on the Dan River are moving up and down the river as they either farm it out, they fish it out, they hunt it out, whatever. So, yes, Lower Saartown is a very light footprint, but when you combine it with some of the other sites like Upper Saartown, the Nifong site, the Klutz site, what was the other one? Not the Madison. Anyway, there are other sites along the Dan River, and we can see sort of a. Can somebody walk, please? We've been sitting too long. So it's kind of Lower Saartown, yes, is light footprint, but then there's this larger sort of cultural continuity where you can see this group did evolve out of the culture did come from these other sites along the Dan River. It's just like anybody else. People move around, they find better housing. I've moved from one side of Kernersville to the other side of Kernersville because there was better housing, better opportunities. I've moved to Raleigh, Greenville, Wilmington, Virginia, Williamsburg, Virginia. I don't know why I said Wilmington. So you just move around as you find opportunities and what suits your life.
You mentioned something leading up to a question here.
Mm-hmm.
Thought occurs to me, and so I try to express it. You mentioned the weirs, the fish weirs, and the one that is the most well-known is just outside of Madison. If you're coming south from Highway 135 towards 704, as you come over the river, you'll see a historical marker that talks about that. And as an aside, I think that state historical marker was the first marker for a non-building structure. Lindley Butler applied for it probably back in the 70s, and it was recognized that the fish weirs were historic. But also know that there are other weirs along the Mayo and the dam. There's some that are visible if you're looking off the hillside to the dam from, it's just north of Marion, between Marion and Stonewall. And I'm sure there are others, the fish weirs. So that leads to my question, how close were the weirs to the settlements, the Indian population centers? You know, we think of Upper Saartown and Lower Saartown, but I don't remember hearing fish weirs associated with them. But we see fish weirs at places that we don't associate, or I haven't been associating with Native American population centers. So how does that?
You just created a master's dissertation for a budding archaeologist somewhere, because I have not seen any, at least not in relationship with the Piedmont region. I have not seen any studies.
Fish weirs are permanent structures.
Mm-hmm. And they're very another thing with it, they're very efficient, And not all the fish weirs in the Dan River were built by natives because they were so efficient that when the Europeans arrived, they started building their own fish weirs.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have the answer to that question because nobody's tried to answer. No, at least as far as I know, nobody's asked that question.
And examples are in our exhibit too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
May I ask you a question about turtles?
Yeah.
From what I've read previously, they utilize turtles frequently and.
A master's student did do a weighted analysis of faunal remains from Upper Saratown and one of the other sites in Stokes, and across all occupational periods, turtles were between 2 and 4 in the most the highest amount of remains.
And so you found evidence that they ate them, and then that would imply that they also used them as tools or resources? I mean, the shell itself.
The shell, nobody mentioned, I'd not seen any mention of shell. So this is the problem with reading archaeologists going back and looking at, I did not really get that deep into the appendices where they would have included that stuff because I was trying to cram a lot of information in at one time. So there may have been shell there, and I could imagine there being uses of shell. But I don't know what it is off the top of my head.
No, that's fair. But I mean, they were relevant and they showed up.
Yeah, they show up a lot as a major food source.
So did they have any like direct contact with Europeans? I mean, they trading, but
If we believe John Lederer, yes, he had direct contact with them at Upper Saratown.
okay.
I think he just says Saratown, so I'm going to say Upper, but it could have been Lower. We don't really know which one. And yes, in the trade when they were doing after the Okanichi are taken out by the Virginian colonists, then they start having direct contact with traders, but that's going to be like the really adventurous people who are willing to really go out and be the contact for the deer trade. So that they're going to have some contact for about 30, 40 years directly, but only with 1 or 2, 3, 4 traders coming out of the Chesapeake Bay area.
So do we know like anything of like their culture, beliefs?
What we talked about was the burial practices. That's about it. I mean, we can make inferences from other Siouan cultures, so we can look at information we have about the Catawba, who we do have better written records about. We can look at what the Catawba were doing. My hope is coming out of this Jawara project that's been going on for about a decade or two in the mountains. We'll get some more information out of that because we do know they were trading with both Juan Pardo, the Spanish conquistador who settled Fort San Juan just beside Jawara, and from Hernan de Soto, that they mentioned the Sara people, so we know there's some sort of connection between the Sara and the Jawara, we think, because they use a Spanish word that's been translated into Shira. So there might be some more information coming. And that's the great thing about archaeology is there's always more information to learn, and there's hope that the next project that gets done, the next excavation that gets done, will help build that picture a little clearer.
Have they been called Sara since the earliest contact? Where did the name Sara come from?
I think it comes. I don't know. It's very because if you get on Wikipedia, and I know the teachers in this room just all rolled their eyes at me.
Oh, no.
And if you get on Wikipedia and type in Cheraw, Cheraw, it will list an also known by, or also known as.
Sara.
And the Sara there, along with like 10 other names, including some that seem to be very Spanish, like Zula, I think was one of them. Some names I had never heard associated with the Sara.
I hadn't thought of that until, like, before I asked the question, the idea
I
that
th-
Shara and Sara, actually, depending on who's saying the
Mhm.
words, they could be pronounced
I
pretty similar.
think the term Sara probably comes from letterer, and that's also what William Byrd refers to them as. So it may be an English language thing. With Shara, I think is and you may be able to correct me on this, it's the Siouan word.
So Sara could be an anglicized.
Shara, yeah. And then I think I have not read Juan Pardo or Hernan de Soto in the original Spanish, so I don't know what word they actually used to describe the peoples they met.
In your studies, did you run across the estimated population before and after?
I think, when was it? I think Upper Saratown was about 1,000.
Right.
And that was the only population estimate I really came across.
And I think that dwindled down to like less than 200
Yeah.
or something like that. That's how impactful it was for
Mhm.
the diseases and everything.
And there seems to be, right before Europeans arrived, and this was one of those things I didn't really want to get into, but you got me going in that direction. There does seem to be a more complex society developing among the Siouan-speaking peoples out of Asheville. Salisbury. Seems to be the center of Siouan-speaking, and this is where I'm getting into conjecture. If we look at what's happened in the Chesapeake Bay region with the Powhatan, when Jamestown is settled. Powhatan is actually the name. It's not the name of the people, it's the name of the tribal chief for the village closest to Jamestown, and he leads a confederacy of Algonquin-speaking villages that are referred to as Powhatan because of the village chief who's responsible for organizing this confederacy. And we seem to see the Siouan speakers moving in a similar direction, and then the Spanish and the English show up, and that whole the complexity of society, because the whole reason societies become complex is because you have a bigger population that needs to be managed. You need more, it leads to a more stratified society. Work needs to be organized better, so you have people rising to like manager level positions, but they usually become the elite or the aristocracy in a European context. So you start seeing this complexity build up in societies to try to account for larger populations that need more food. And we already see with maize, they have the food production to handle more people. But then the Europeans arrive, they bring disease, they increase pressures, that increase intertribal conflicts, tribal warfare, and that's when you start seeing, so it kind of stops the development of the complex society that may have been developing in the Piedmont area.
There's a youth powwow that this will be the third year. It'll be at Moorhead High School the last Saturday in April, and you can learn a lot more about the Native American culture. All the dancers, performers, the drummers, the singers, everybody's under the age of 16. And it was the only youth powwow that's done on the Eastern Seaboard.
Mm.
And we started a couple of years ago. I've been going to a lot of Native American powwows throughout the Eastern Seaboard. And I went to Cindy Adams with the city of Eden and said, Cindy, would y'all consider doing a powwow here? I'll talk to some of the people that I know with the Sara connection. And she said, oh yeah, we'd love to do it. So I called Patrick Suarez, who organized 3 or 4 powwows, the Meharry powwow, the King City powwow, and other ones. I said, hey Patrick, would y'all consider doing a powwow up here? And he said, well, I had a vision last night about doing a youth powwow. It's never been done. And he said, do you think they would do a youth powwow? And I said, I think they would be all for it. And it is an absolutely very inspiring experience. You'll learn about the different dances, their regalia, what all that means to them, and all that. And they'll have vendors there that will have authentic made Native American crafts and stuff like that. So it's a really uplifting experience to see those kids perform and how excited. And they all, they'll have a head female dancer, head male dancer, an MC, and then the singers on the drums. Each drum has a name. Each drum has a core group of drummers. They all practice all year round getting ready for it, and it's just so inspiring.
So what particular Native American group they associate
They come
with?
from, what they call a gathering of nations.
Mhm.
It's mainly from the 8 nations that are recognized in North Carolina.
Okay.
Lumbee, Cherokee, Kahari, Maharan, Hiawassee, Pony.
Yeah, and
It's-
a lot of them in eastern North Carolina,
Yeah.
Enfield, Halifax County, in fact.
Okanichi. So, but yeah, it's a beautiful thing. So, bring your students. They would,
You said the
last
Saturday
Saturday
in April
in April, it's free of charge.
at Morehead High School.
Morehead High School.
And also, thank you all for coming out tonight, listening to me ramble about something I've been passionate about for a while since I started working up here. If you didn't get a bookmark, there are bookmarks for everybody to take. December 7th, we're having a 1940s Christmas party. I know, completely different. We're going in a completely different direction at Wright Tavern in Wentworth, across the street from the museum. It's from 1 to 4 that Saturday. Everyone's invited to come out, enjoy some 1940s style food, and see the tavern decorated with 1940s Christmas decorations.
CJ, today on PBS,
Mhm.
there's a great program on Indian dancing and so forth, spirit. It was beautiful. This Indian dancer had all the rings,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just phenomenal what he did.
And I'll say, me and Gordon have a shared friend from my time at East Carolina, Travis Dunn, and he is is he still part of the Screaming Eagles?
Yes.
Yeah, the Screaming Eagles of the Lumbee. If you ever get a chance to go see them perform at a powwow or anywhere, I highly recommend it. It is a very moving experience to see some of these groups get together and perform. Okay, and thank you all. If you want to check out some pottery, some more projectile points, you're welcome to check those out.